Hey, what's up, everybody? It's another Grayzone Live. I'm Max Blumenthal here in the heart of the beast where the sausage is made in the depths of the swamp. And I'm joined as always, or as usual, on Friday by my friend and colleague, Canadian award-winning journalist, Aaron Mate. What's up, Aaron?
What's up, Max? What's up, everybody? Thanks for joining us. Remember to like the stream if you can, because we're going to be suppressed and demonetized. So liking it helps us gain more visibility. And yeah, what another horrific day in this ongoing massacre in Gaza. I think the other day when you guys went live with Dan Kovalik, that was right after or as the Jabalia massacre happened.
Yep.
Now today we have to talk about a new massacre at the Al-Shifa hospital, which Israel has just bombed. And
yeah, it seems like there's 3 giant massacres a day.
Yeah.
They bombed UN schools. Everyone was focused on Jabalia, a UN school. There was a massacre in the courtyard of a UN school yesterday. White phosphorus was dumped on a UN school. A journalist from Palestine TV and his entire family of 10 were killed in their home in Khan Yunis. Palestine TV is funded by the Palestinian Authority, has nothing to do with Hamas. This is a well-known figure all across Gaza who was reporting from all the major events. I mean, just imagine if your, parents' favorite news anchor was killed by a foreign army in their home. That's what it's like. And this is about the 30th journalist who's been killed in Gaza. So it's sort of hard to keep track of all these massacres. And today I woke up from a nightmare, looked at my phone, and I couldn't tell the difference between the nightmare and what I was seeing on my phone because it's infected my mentality so much. It's our job to keep up on events, and it's also personal. If you're a Jew who's been struggling against Zionism for as long as we have, it affects you in a different way, and it has really been mentally scarring. Obviously, it's physically scarring for people in Gaza. I was following one account who tweets only in Arabic in Gaza, and he said, the horror we are experiencing right now, there's no comparison to it. We are all the walking dead. And then he started to kind of resort to prayers. But it's scarring to witness this from the outside and to stare at it. We're watching one snuff film after another, one Israeli produced snuff film after another. There's also the footage of the dead bodies along the Al Rashid Street, which I've driven up and down many times in Gaza. It's the north-south highway, and people were just cut down and killed trying to flee to the south where Israel's telling them to go. This all took place as Tony Blinken was back in Tel Aviv to meet with the war cabinet and give another bear hug to Netanyahu.
And claiming he's there to talk about ways to protect Palestinian civilians as part of this weird new line he's trying out, that he's like, we don't have to choose between helping Israel defend itself and aiding Palestinian civilians. When, of course, by definition, if you're helping Israel defend itself, quote unquote, then you're helping massacre Palestinians. It's the most cynical line I really can ever see. And here he is, met with senior Israeli leadership today. Israel has the right to defend itself against terrorism and ensure this never happens again. We discussed concrete steps that can and should be taken to protect civilians. And he puts this out, and meanwhile, and I wonder if this is deliberate, as he's doing this, just to show him and the world what a farce this is. Israel, because they're so sadistic, bombs all these different civilian areas, including the Al-Shifa hospital. I think that's deliberate.
Yeah, well, there was some discussion of a humanitarian pause, this phony idea that they could pause Israel's barbaric assault on Gaza for a few days while it has troops inside Gaza, and that would allow them to get maybe some people out through the Rafah crossing. And Netanyahu just openly said, we're not doing any humanitarian pause. And what does Blinken do? He just shrugs and says, okay. I mean, what leverage do they have, especially if Biden's running for re-election? They have no leverage. Israel is dictating what's taking place, and the U.S. is assisting it and doing whatever it wants. And so this was a way of telling the Americans, look, you want your humanitarian aid? Or here's your humanitarian aid. We're going to bomb the biggest hospital. We're going to blow up ambulances. We're going to kill people in the courtyard. Thousands of people. The entire neighborhood of Al Rimal has been blown up by Israel, and that's the neighborhood around Al Shifa. And so they're all living in tents there, like refugees. And I mean, I don't want to show the more horrific footage. There's footage of people and children just lying in pools of blood. Children's bodies are just like twisted and broken in hideous ways. It's disgusting and infuriating. But this is footage that was shot by a journalist on the scene, Heba Jamal.
They bombed the door of the hospital. They bombed. I've been there before 2 minutes. It's a massacre. Thousands of people are out. Thousands of people. Thousands. All of these people lost their homes. They are evacuating to Shifa. They are sitting outside because there is no places in Shifa. They bombed the place outside. They bombed the door. I've been there just before 2 minutes. It could be me.
So that's what it looked like today outside Al Shifa. Today being, Eastern time being like 7 hours behind their time, but just a monstrous attack. Israel is,
and that's the least gruesome. That's the least gruesome footage we could show. There's footage that's so much more gruesome than that, which we're not showing. But that's just a small window into the barbarism.
Every time I scroll, I just see exploded bodies, bloody children. Right now, there are hundreds of people in Gaza who are trapped under rubble, who are starving and freezing to death and literally buried alive because no one can get them out of their homes. And that is what Tony Blinken and Joe Biden have sanctioned. Genocide Joe Biden have sanctioned in the Gaza Strip. Tony Blinken is there to give a green light. Every day there will be a new massacre. And as we pointed out last week, Israel has explicitly identified Al Shifa Hospital as a target, producing animated cartoons of Hamas tunnels underneath the hospital to justify striking it. Well, this is, go ahead.
On the point of view about U.S. leverage, I mean, I think the key point there is, as you said, like Biden wants to be reelected. So he wants to be in the good graces of AIPAC and, the major pro-Israel Democratic Party leadership. But if Biden wanted to, I do think he could, I don't know about stop this, but at least significantly constrain Israel. We know he's done so in the past. When Israel was attacking Gaza in May 2021, there's an account in a book by Franklin Foer, who's like a stenographer for the Biden administration, writes for the Atlantic magazine. He has a new book about Biden's presidency. And he points out that basically as soon as Biden told Netanyahu, it's over, we're not going to support you anymore, Netanyahu agreed to a ceasefire. And maybe things are different today, but the point is there is a precedent where Biden has used U.S. leverage after enough people, in his view, were killed in Gaza, finally put it to an end, that they could try today, at least try. But of course, they're not doing that. And we saw that now, as you pointed out. Blinken said for the first time, after weeks of resisting this, that we should have a humanitarian pause, which basically means let's pause the massacres, not stop them permanently, but let's at least pause them. And Netanyahu has just rebuffed Blinken. But what if the U.S. actually used its leverage and said, okay, fine, we're not going to give you military support anymore. We're not going to cover for you at the UN. Would that make a difference? It might.
It would possibly. Well, first of all, there's a huge disparity between the donor class that disproportionately supports Israel, the Democratic Party donor class, and is responsible for almost every Democrat voting for this House resolution yesterday to condemn college campuses for allowing anti-Semitism and basically crack down on students protesting this assault. And there's a disparity between them and the Democratic Party base. Biden's support has dropped 11 points, at least. They're now polling out of Michigan shows Arab Americans are overwhelmingly leaving the Biden Democratic Party camp over this assault, which could cost him the state. The governor of Michigan is a key Biden ally, Gretchen Whitmer, who has refused to support Israel in any public statement that I've seen because she's so afraid of what could happen to her. And that's leverage that should be exploited. So Biden is kind of in a catch-22 situation, but of course he's Biden. He's status quo Joe. He's going to side with the donor class every time. And he himself has gone to AIPAC back when he was compos mentis, and he would say, I had hung out with gold in my ear and I told her I am not Jewish, but I'm a Zionist. So that's Joe Biden. Tony Blinken is even more invested in the project of Israel. He comes from a long line of pro-Israel lobbyists. His father-in-law, Samuel Pisar, his grandfather, Maurice, they were Israel lobbyists. So this is personal for them. They didn't know how to respond after October 7th. It was the worst military humiliation for Israel in its history. And they just decided to let Israel off the chain. And Israel off the chain does mean genocide. I mean, that's why I went to the State Department right after October 7th as Israel started exterminating children and killing people in their homes, because I know what they do, because I covered what they did in 2014 and ever since, and started pushing the State Department spokesman to try to condemn any of it. And he wouldn't condemn any of it. They had given Israel the full green light. And now it's too late for them to turn back. So I think what they're hoping for is Netanyahu collapses under internal pressure, and then they can start shaping a new coalition that'll bring forward some kind of resolution. But if you look at the people who are in Netanyahu's opposition, they're the former Israeli army chiefs of staff, the former heads of the Mossad, all the security chiefs who had been responsible for the butchery carried out on Gaza in past assaults. So I don't really see what the U.S. is doing here, except letting Israel set the stage for an even greater conflict. Because who will stop this and what will stop it? International law is not stopping it. The UN is not able to stop it. So only force will stop it. And the one force in the region capable of altering the equation on the ground, the military equation on the ground, is Hezbollah. So everyone was anticipating, from Washington to Gaza to Tel Aviv, which has censored this speech, the address of Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah, the sort of spiritual and intellectual guide of Hezbollah in Beirut today. I predicted on Jackson Hinkle's show yesterday that he would not announce a great military escalation and would opt for strategic patience. And I was right. I don't think Lebanon can afford just going headlong. Lebanese society can't afford going headlong into a war with Israel at this point. And so that's what he said. But let's take a listen to one thing that I think was significant that Hassan Nasrallah said, which was essentially that this is a U.S. war. And he placed the blame firmly on the U.S. and the Biden administration for allowing Israel to go as far as it has.
These operations in the south, the blood of our fallen martyrs, and the sacrifices by the fellow fighters and our honest, noble men who remain in the south, or those who are temporarily displaced, they are all sacrificing to this battle that is worthy of each sacrifice. It is.
Let's move ahead. Also, Press TV had a much better translator than Al Jazeera, but this is the Al Jazeera translator.
Front, any escalation and any development of whatever nature are hinged are hinged on two things, nothing more: the development of events in Gaza. It is the first factor, the development of events in Gaza. That's why this front will devolve according to the nature of development in Gaza and what is required.
So it's just kind of translating that, and it's what I've been saying for the last 2 weeks, and what many have been saying is that Hezbollah is going to allow the Palestinian armed factions to fight for themselves in Gaza, and they will not allow, he may be suggesting that Hezbollah will not allow Gaza to fall to an Israeli reoccupation.
Second factor that is in play is the conduct and the demeanor of the Zionist enemy towards Lebanon. And here, once again, I warn you not to go further, as many civilians have fallen as martyrs. And this will bring us to the same equation: a civilian for a civilian. Again, the demeanors of the enemy against Lebanon will be a factor in play. I am speaking openly, candidly, and at the same time with ambiguity, constructive ambiguity. All scenarios are open. All scenarios are open on our Lebanese southern front.
It's actually all options are on the table.
I reiterate, all scenarios are open. All options are laid out, and we can adopt any at any point of time. We all together must be prepared, ready, and available to all these scenarios and options to come.
So, Aaron, I don't know if you have any reaction. I got a few more takeaways.
It sounds to me like he doesn't want a regional war, but he's not going to rule it out. That's what I took from this speech. And I think it seems to me he's content playing the role that he's currently played of just basically tying up Israel on the northern front without engaging in a full-scale war. He talked about how Israel's been forced to divert some of its resources that it's being used to attack Gaza onto the northern front. And to me, it underscores that, yeah, I don't think Hamas, I mean, I don't know much internally about Hamas and Hezbollah, except that both are resistance groups. They respond to aggression. That's why both were formed. Hezbollah was formed after Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982 and killed tens of thousands of people. They were formed to defend Lebanon from that, and they succeeded ultimately in driving Israel out. But it doesn't seem to me that Hezbollah had any knowledge of what Hamas did on October 7th. And you can look for there's other evidence of that. For example, these groups, at least the political leadership of Hamas, and maybe you can explain if you want the dynamics here, because if you think it's important. But in Syria, for example, the political leadership of Hamas were on different sides of Hezbollah. Hamas took the side. The political leadership of Hamas took the side of Qatar and Saudi Arabia in supporting the dirty war, and even helped facilitate it to a certain extent. I know the armed faction of Hamas had a split in that, but to me, again, all this underscores this idea that all these are just Iranian proxies all operating together in close coordination. I'm sure there's some truth to that, but the idea that they're all just inseparable, to me, that is just not borne out by any of the facts.
Yeah, that's an important point. He said that, the Iranian leadership said that October 7th was kept a secret from them. Obviously, Israel's Unit 8200 is tasked with picking up any signals intelligence, and so it would have risked the entire operation to inform them. They may have had different opinions about it, but this mission was devised, conceived, and carried out exclusively in Gaza, it appears. And so that left Hezbollah with very little time to actually prepare to take on Israel, to confront Israel on the northern frontier. Since the confrontation has begun, it's been sort of a low-intensity series of skirmishes with the Israeli army and Hezbollah striking each other's communications equipment, Israel also attacking civilians in the southern areas. Hezbollah has struck as far as Kiryat Shimona, which is a little bit beyond the frontier and is a population center. So the entire north is now depopulated and evacuated by Israel. The only thing there is army. And so this speech was an opportunity, I think, or an attempt to buy more time for Hezbollah to be able to conceive a strategy if things go beyond the low intensity series of skirmishes we're seeing. And that suggests that we're going to be in a pretty long war here. I don't expect a ceasefire anytime soon. I would be greatly relieved to see one, but I don't expect to see one at all. And if you look at Israeli society and the depths to which it's sunken into sadistic depravity, it's going to be difficult for any politician in Israel to tone that down, to turn down the temperature among the public. They want revenge for October 7th. And whatever the reality of October 7th was, non-combatants, Jewish Israeli non-combatants being shot in large numbers, along with large numbers of uniformed military. What the Israeli public believes about it is that women were gang raped in the streets after they were taken back to Gaza, that fetuses were cut out of the bellies of women. They believe every story. There's no one checking the facts on that. And they are reenacting those crimes now against Palestinian prisoners. Again, I can't show that footage, but Palestinians have been, workers are being captured and tied up in the West Bank and tortured gleefully on camera by Israeli soldiers. So this to me seems like a long war is in order.
And this is what happens when you're when you're a settler colonial state. Like, you're not driven by security for yourself and your people. If you were, you just would not be occupying and displacing them. You're driven by a desire to dominate. And so whenever the people you're occupying hate you, then your only imperative is to show what's called your deterrence capacity, which basically means that you have to show that you're impenetrable, because if you're not impenetrable, then you can't be a successful colonial power. So the logic of occupation, the imperatives of occupation, require you to constantly commit these violent massacres, even if ultimately it undermines your own security, which it does. Even if you don't care about Palestinian life and you're an Israeli chauvinist, you just care about your own security. This undermines it, but that doesn't matter to these people because they're not driven by security; they're driven by supremacy.
Yeah, I mean, just to illustrate that point, here's the latest viral video trend going around in Jewish Israeli society, and it's essentially mocking Palestinians for being tortured by Israel. Basically, they were tortured by being forced to listen to an Israeli children's song for 8 hours while tied up and blindfolded. And so, when a famous Israeli journalist filmed a video of his friends mocking the Palestinians listening to the children's song in his car, using his children as props. Then they brought the singer of the song to an Israeli army base near Gaza to perform, to hype up the soldiers. Then this other singer visits the soldiers and helps out a genocidal anthem. Who doesn't have water, food, and electricity in Gaza? We're going to build a carnival there in Gaza. Who's going to live in tents? Gaza. Then you have all the detainees being forced to hold the Israeli flag and sing "The people of Israel live" while they're being interrogated. This is a Israeli filming himself with detainees in his car, basically captives, singing along. And they're reenacting the crimes they've been told were committed on October 7th, gleefully. There's also a story I I'll tweet about it. It's going around in Hebrew leftist circles or in Israeli leftist circles about a young woman at an Israeli university, I think in Netanya. And she got into an argument with fellow students about the war. She's sort of a leftist. And so they called her a Hamas member or Hamasnik. And she said, and they were like pushing her around and dumping water on her. And they're filming it. And she said, yeah, I'm a Hamasnik. I'm a Hamasnik. What? I'm like a member of the like central committee of Hamas. You know, when people get, when people become sarcastic when they're being bullied and say, yeah, whatever you say. She was arrested and she was detained and interrogated in front of an Israeli flag as Hamas members were. So that's how insane Israel has gone at this point. And, you know, okay, it's not a democracy. It's a military dictatorship, but there's a Jewish democracy within the military dictatorship. And the leadership has to answer to the Jewish public, which is braying for blood. And who will protect the civilians in Gaza? That's the pressure on Hassan Nasrallah is from the, I hate to use this term, the Arab street, but
Yeah.
you know, it's from them to actually wage a responsibility to protect humanitarian intervention.
Yeah, but the problem with that for Nasrallah is if he does that, he invites massive death and destruction on Lebanon, as Israel's done many times before. But it's a quandary because Hezbollah has shown that they can inflict serious damage on Israel. They defeated them in 2006 with a much smaller force. They drove Israel out of Lebanon after a multi-decade occupation. And I mean, ever since 2006, that's a long time. So you have to assume now that Hamas is, and this is borne out by some of the available reporting, that Hamas has developed a significant missile and rocket capability that can actually hit the centers of Israel if it wanted to. So it could do damage, but the problem is that would then be inviting damage on Lebanon. I mean, and Max, you know, you've talked about this, the doctrine that Israel pursues in Lebanon, targeting not even bothering to pretend it's targeting Hezbollah targets, but just civilian areas where it's believed that they have popular support.
Well, Nasrallah referred repeatedly to the July 2006 war with Israel, which took up the whole month of July. And Hezbollah was seen sort of as the political victor of that war and fought Israel to a military stalemate, drove it out of Lebanese territory after capturing several Israeli soldiers. And what he said was Israel has no ability to reject prisoner exchanges, as we showed there. They captured Israeli soldiers. And ultimately, after they engaged in this military folly, they exchanged prisoners for, I believe it was Samir Kuntar, who was a member of PFLP and Hezbollah, who was convicted of terrorism in an Israeli court. And he was eventually released in an exchange with Hezbollah for the bodies of those Israeli soldiers. I could be getting this wrong, but he's saying they're going to engage in another military folly in Gaza using that same doctrine, the Dahiyya doctrine of attacking civilians because they cannot actually destroy the paramilitary infrastructure. And then they're going to have to do a prisoner exchange. And it looks like, unfortunately, they may be doing a prisoner exchange for more dead bodies because they show no interest in trying to recover the bodies, in trying to recover the living Jewish Israelis who are in Gaza. I mean, I don't see how this operation has anything to do with recovering captives.
No, if anything, it's killing them. But let me ask you about Hamas's capabilities so far. They put out some videos of their fighters invading Israeli tanks. You've seen those videos, I think. What was your impression of that?
Well, let me pull one up. I got to scroll a little bit because I wasn't exactly prepared, but everyone is really focused on one particular video, which shows a member of the Al-Qassam brigades, the military wing of Hamas, placing an explosive charge on an Israeli tank. And here, I'll show it in a second, and blowing off the turret of the tank and then escaping back into a tunnel. This was a tactic that was actually seen in the field in 2014. An Israeli armored personnel carrier was blown up by a sapper team, a Hamas sapper team, and they captured a soldier, Shaul Aron, in July 2014. He died of his wounds, though, and he was not used as collateral. But this is a increasingly familiar tactic, and it shows the difference between Israeli tactics of striking at long range with 2,000-pound bombs and white phosphorus, and the Qassam tactics of close quarters combat, which requires a lot of courage, whether you agree with them or not. Here's some footage. There's more footage coming out today from Beit Hanun of close quarters combat of Israeli Merkavas, which cost something like $6 million each, being destroyed by homemade weapons.
من بعيد مصدق ومن خلفي مصدق فأغشيناهم هم لا يبصرون.
They don't even see him coming.
Crazy.
And then he finishes the tank off or hits it again with a homemade anti-tank grenade, which is called Yassin 105, named for one of the founders of Hamas. And then he retrieves a piece of the tank turret that was blown off. Actually, Nasrallah referred to this attack in his speech as an example of Palestinian bravery, and it's obviously gone viral. But yeah, it doesn't surprise me. I mean, this is the essence of Al-Qassam tactics, because it neutralizes Israeli air power. If they're close to the troops, that close to the Israeli troops, there's no close air support, because they will kill the Israeli troops as well. And we're seeing it again and again. Abu Ubaidah, who is the spokesman for the Al-Qassam brigades and is sort of a folk hero in Palestine, has claimed that an entire battalion of Israeli tanks has already been destroyed. According to his official Israeli numbers, 22 soldiers as of late last night were killed, and that number will continue to go up. Israel says it's surrounded Gaza City. If you actually look at the manifestos of those who have influenced the Al-Qassam brigades, writings of Bassel al-Araj and others, they acknowledge that Israel will ultimately show its tanks inside Gaza City. Soldiers will photograph themselves in the center of key points across Gaza, but that this is not a sign of defeat. It's a sign that the enemy has been drawn in, and it really is irrelevant to the tactics that have been put into play by Al-Qassam, because their war and their organization and their war is literally underground. There are over 7,000 tunnels underneath the Gaza Strip, according to the Israeli Foreign Ministry. So wherever Israeli soldiers pop up, they are sitting targets. And if you look at how much rubble how they've created all this rubble, that makes it more difficult for the Merkava tank to operate. The Merkava became a sitting duck in southern Lebanon because of the terrain. It was so rocky and there were so many valleys. It was sort of like the Soviet defeat in Afghanistan. And Hezbollah possessed Cornet missiles, which are basic anti-tank wire-guided missiles that Qassam also possesses. So I think the longer this goes on, the more we will see Israeli casualties, and that's very painful for Israeli society, Jewish Israeli society, to bear. Which,
by the way,
yeah.
Well, on the topic of these videos, I couldn't help but notice that the preview of the speech by Nasrallah had a trailer. Is that a new thing now, where they're making trailers for these speeches? It's just like I mean, this is just very anecdotal, but it just adds to how surreal this whole war is, that now we get trailers previewing speeches from people like Nasrallah. And I know Israel has its own propaganda operation too, but it's just like, I don't know. I hadn't seen that before.
Yeah, neither had I, but I wasn't surprised. Nasrallah became he became the celebrity across the Arab world after 2006. You know, someone took on Israel in the modern era and actually dealt it a bloody nose and sent it packing. You know, even in the Gulf, Sunnis who would normally hate the so-called axis of resistance considered him a hero. Then if his celebrity waned with the Syrian conflict because Hezbollah entered in a sort of counterinsurgency fashion to beat back the jihadist bandits supported by NATO, and also to defend the Christian communities in Syria. But that, you know, made a lot of people who supported the Syrian armed opposition, which were Sunni Islamists, you know, the Turkish AKP, Qatar, Al Jazeera, they were supporting them. So Nasrallah became sort of a villain, and now he's re-emerging as sort of a uniting figure, someone who's willing to stand up for Palestinians when the rest of the Arab states, these sellout states like Jordan or the Gulf states, who just sit around holding conferences in air-conditioned banquet halls, he's willing to actually do something. But it's unclear what he's going to do, whether he will intervene, Hezbollah will intervene. It's not just Nasrallah calling the shots. So I think right now, all we can predict are surprises. And what I can confidently say is that the Israeli military death toll will continue to escalate inside Gaza as they succeed in the war on Palestinian babies.
I wanted to show this. This is happening right now as we're broadcasting. In Oakland, protesters blockading a U.S. ship that's being used to ship weapons to Israel. And it's happening at the Port of Oakland, where there's a history of activism, similar actions like this. But this is going on as we speak. And this weekend, on Saturday, November 4th, demonstrations going on everywhere. In D.C., a huge rally starting at 2 p.m. at Freedom Plaza. And, you know, maybe we can talk for a second, Max. I mean, you've seen the protests that have been going on, those images of Jewish-led protests in Grand Central, all these people getting arrested. I can't recall in my lifetime anywhere close to this level of activism against Israeli massacres as we're seeing right now.
Yeah, I mean, that footage you're showing shows not the first time there's been an attempt to block the boats from shipping arms and other goods to Israel. In Oakland, the Longshoremen's Union has participated in some of these actions. They're traditionally an anti-war, socialist-oriented union, but the intensity of protest and the numbers are just off the charts. Every city, in smaller cities, there are huge protests in Baltimore taking place. It's not just DC. I think we'll see the largest protest in solidarity with Palestine in history in Washington, D.C. tomorrow. There have been actions going on all over the place. And we were from the first generation of American Jews who started protesting Israel on a larger scale. I mean, before us, there were individuals like Norman Finkelstein, people associated with the Communist Party in the US who would kind of protest individually, who are seen as just like insane lone people.
Yeah.
But we went through the experience of the Second Intifada, the destruction of the Jenin refugee camp, then the 2006 war when southern Lebanon was destroyed, and then the first really major brutal war on Gaza, Operation Cast Lead, which took place after Obama had been elected, while Obama just sat there knowing what was going on and saying nothing.
Yeah.
And for me, that was
rearming Israel in the process.
Yes. And then rearming Israel. And that, was a radicalizing process for me that led you can draw a straight line from there to where I'm sitting right now, virtually next to you. So now we're seeing Jewish anti-Zionism take a, I don't want to say a mainstream position within the Jewish world, but has consolidated itself as a place at the table. And Jewish Zionists are now saying that Jewish anti-Zionists at the table are like the four sons from Passover. They're the wicked son who questions the community, and they're getting desperate. They're afraid because this is getting traction in a way like it hasn't before. I actually talked to someone more on the inside track in Washington, who said kind of jokingly to me like that I'm radicalizing his son. And I said, feel free to give him my email if he has any questions. And he said, no, I don't want you to radicalize him on any other issues.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the Jewish establishment in the US is completely discredited. I mean, the only thing they have is just propaganda. They're in a total moral freefall to line up with the depravity of Israel on this. So expect these protests to grow. I mean, the Jewish Voice for Peace protests are just continuing at Grand Central. There was a protest blocking trains at 30th Street Station in Philadelphia. And there are actually people on that boat now doing the equivalent of a tree sit on that boat at the port of Oakland, blocking it from leaving. So this is important. What people need to do, as I've been saying, is if they're going to go to these protests and they're going to go in large numbers, we only have so much power in a pseudo democracy like the US, but you do have the power to boycott, as anyone who supports the BDS movement knows. And so you have the power to boycott Biden, who's basically counting on these people's votes, because these tend to be sort of progressives who families or who themselves typically vote Democrat because they're afraid of the fascist next Hitler getting into office. And Biden's going to tell everybody, as they always do, that there's no other choice. They have nowhere else to go, and that the only other option is Trump or DeSantis, who has banned SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine chapters in Florida, or is seeking to do so, and shred the Constitution. And they just have to say no. You have to say no. You are going to pay a price. You are going to be held accountable for authoring this genocide. And no one can get elected without us. And the most power that supporters of Palestine have is in Michigan. So Biden should be dealt a blow in Michigan as punishment for this. And I'm encouraging everyone to write in a watermelon, melon 2024, write in a melon, because the watermelon has become the symbol of Palestine internationally, especially in countries like Germany, which have banned display of the Palestinian flag. The UK is treating it as a sign of terror sympathy. And so the colors of the watermelon, red, black, and green, are also the colors of the Palestinian flag. And a lot of people in Germany are waving placards with watermelon. So this is a way of saying, I did not vote for Biden because of the genocide in Gaza. I wrote in a watermelon. So take the pledge, Melon 2024, and I'll be working on trying to get a melon elected in 2024, or at least create a spoiler effect, because it doesn't seem like there's any other independent candidate who's going to be on the ballot that is worth that will send the same message. That's one thing we can do. I'm going to be at the protest tomorrow. I'll be documenting it. I don't know if you're involved in anything, Aaron, or I don't even know where you are.
I'm in LA right now, and here last weekend there was a huge protest downtown. It was awesome, and I don't know if there is one here this weekend, but if there is one, I'll be there for sure.
Well, sorry you can't make it in DC.
Yeah.
But I know tons of people converging on DC.
Oh yeah.
It's going to be
huge. If you're out there and if you have the means to make it, the time, I wouldn't miss it. It's going to be historic, I think.
And I love seeing it like frighten neocons.
Yeah, like the one also in the UK, in London, which was massive, and people are neocons there are freaking out about that, and I mean they're scared because they're losing the narrative. They don't have the stranglehold over the narrative like they used to, and the traditional tactics of just accusing anyone who criticizes Israel of anti-Semitism, it's not working anymore. People aren't intimidated by that anymore, and it's long overdue.
Yeah, I saw this neocon, basically professional anti-Muslim activist pundit Douglas Murray freaking out about the rally in the UK and saying that he basically said British citizens must confront the protesters and physically stop them. He's basically, here it is. He's basically calling for like a civil war, vigilante violence on Palestine solidarity protesters. UK Hamas supporters are now planning a 1 million man march on Remembrance Day, which is the day of remembering World War II. They plan to defame our war dead and desecrate the cenotaph itself. This is the tipping point. If such a march goes ahead, then the people of Britain must come out and stop these barbarians. I responded, what are you going to do, neocon?
And this is the same crowd, Jordan Peterson as well, that they made their name in part by being against, it's called wokeism, making fun of, sensitive liberals who want to ban views they disagree with. And this is, they're being far worse because they're not just calling for censoring pro-Palestinian views, but directly now confronting them. All these characters, we've talked about this, Barry Weiss, all these characters are just being exposed as complete frauds, if it wasn't already obvious before, which it should have been.
When they always mock people, and to some extent I agree with them. I hate a lot of elements of wokeism, especially the policing of language.
Yeah, sure.
And the construction of this phony language to avoid the sensitivities of these tiny newly constructed demographic groups that represent 0.00001 of the population.
Yeah.
But they themselves are the biggest snowflakes. They're the most easily triggered people. Whenever anything happens to Israel, all of a sudden their ethno-religious group becomes the most important group that must be placed at the center of history. And any affront to this pampered, affluent element that can afford $50,000 a year colleges on leafy campuses all of a sudden becomes the thing we should preoccupy ourselves with, and we should pass new laws and shut down any affront to their feelings. So they're always like, facts, like what does Ben Shapiro, he says in his bio, facts don't care about your feelings. Well, his feelings are now the most important thing in the world just because he's a Jewish supremacist.
Yes.
And then, a lot of them oppose the mask mandates and the vaccine mandates. And I agreed with them on that, but they want to not only they want a muzzle mandate on anyone who wants to say anything against the systematic extermination of Palestinian civilians in Gaza. They're the biggest frauds.
Which means you can really count on one hand the people who are consistent on when it comes to free speech and protecting people's actual rights. And Max, there's you, Jimmy Dore also, obviously too, and he's been great on this issue on Palestine, but so many other people having such disappointments. Like, remember RFK? Where is he even now? He's made himself totally irrelevant by clinging to the flag of ultra-Zionism.
Well, it's weird what he's done, because I thought he was kind of challenging Biden from the Democratic Party, but now he's declared that he's an independent. He is showing some strength in the polls, or he could be a factor in the polls, but it's in pulling people away from Trump because he's taken on so many positions typically associated with the right, including shining the shoes of Netanyahu. And so he's actually become the Trojan horse candidate for Biden. Was that what he intended? And, he got rid of Dennis Kucinich left in disgust. I don't know exactly what happened as his campaign manager. Now he has this cringeworthy former CIA agent named Amaryllis Fox, who's his daughter-in-law, managing his campaign. I defy anyone to sit through one of her TED Talks without like vomiting in your mouth or hysterically laughing at how cringeworthy and phony it is. Her book about being a CIA agent is just one story after another about like, smuggling out SD cards in her bodily orifices so that she can get a speech by some, CIA regime change asset out to the world. I think it's mostly made up, but it also shows that, she is someone who is like a liberal CIA operative running his campaign. So what is he anymore? I mean, I kind of got off the track a little bit, but what is he? And then you got Cornel West. He had Peter Dow come in, like destroy any dignity surrounding his campaign. He left the Green Party. We don't know why. The Green Party doesn't have a candidate. He's now independent. He doesn't have the organization to get on the ballot. And Peter Dow has now left the campaign for health reasons, leaving Cornel to just basically do a bunch of speeches at rallies. I mean, that's not a presidential campaign, like doing speeches at a few rallies here and there. That's why I think Mellon 2024 is so important, because there really isn't anyone. There isn't any real protest vote where you can say this candidate got tens of thousands of votes in this state and had a spoiler effect because people were so disgusted with what Genocide Joe did in Gaza. There isn't anyone.
Yeah.
Maybe there will be a Green Party candidate soon, but the Green Party has not always been good on Palestine. The last person they had was Howie Hawkins. He was like terrible.
Yeah, sure. So
they need to be pressured. They whoever assumes the candidacy for the Green Party needs to openly support BDS and support the demands of the Palestine Solidarity Movement. And so that's why another important aspect of Mellon 2024 is that those who converge around it can make a demand of the Green Party candidate. You don't get our vote unless you uphold the Mellon. Bend a knee to the Mellon. Yeah, but there's a lot of frauds, Aaron, and a lot of just genocidal freaks in U.S. politics. How about this Brian Mast speech? This is one of the most disgusting speeches I've seen of many disgusting speeches on the House floor. And Brian Mast is...
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, he's a member of Congress, and also he served in the IDF, if I have that correctly. He's the guy who showed up the other day in Congress wearing his IDF gear. And here he is.
As a whole, I would encourage the other side to not so lightly throw around the idea of innocent Palestinian civilians, as is frequently said. I don't think we would so lightly throw around the term innocent Nazi civilians during World War II.
Oh, touche. Great point. All those babies are Nazis. I mean, do we even support the firebombing of Dresden now? Or everyone in Germany and SS Einsatzgruppen member following the ideology of the Obergruppenführer? No, it's disgusting. This is just genocidal. This is just a genocidal cue ball on the floor of the House. He's not even Jewish, by the way. He's an evangelical Christian who,
of course, volunteered
for the Israeli military and then got AIPAC money. He's one of his top donor is AIPAC, and he's, I think, the second one of the. Yeah, it's just basically a marionette for AIPAC, spouting genocide, which means the Israel lobby is itself a genocide lobby. And then, yeah, Tulsi Gabbard, who I thought was kind of anti-war, who's never really, she in the past had taken a terrible line on Israel-Palestine. She appeared at a Christians United for Israel conference, but that was before she then joined the Bernie campaign and started emerging as a moderately anti-war candidate who had some interesting positions, opposing regime change in Syria, and opposing, supporting détente with North Korea. You know, unpopular positions within both parties, and she took brave stands. And now she sounds just pretty much like your average Republican on Israel-Palestine. Well, this is her tweet. Islamist jihadists, both Sunni and Shiite, openly call for wiping out all Jews from the face of the earth. Do they? Yet Cori Bush, the Squad, and others support or act as apologists for such jihadists and say that Israel is guilty of human rights abuses and genocide. This is one of the main reasons I left the Democratic Party, because it is led by and rife with apologists for Islamist jihadists.
I mean, I thought she left the DNC because after she endorsed Bernie and called out the fact that the primary was rigged against them, they started attacking her. Hillary Clinton started calling her a Russian agent. She was viciously smeared as an apologist, you know, and then Kamala Harris attacked her for, she said, was being an apologist for Assad because Tulsi Gabbard opposed the dirty war. But now she's adopting the same smear tactics of the neocons in both parties who smeared her. We have a clip of her on Fox News saying a similar thing. We don't have to play it, but
yeah, it's not worth it.
It's like, is it impossible? Can we not find anybody in U.S. politics who can be consistent? Like, it's either our choices between people like Tulsi, who now smear critics of Israel as being jihadi supporters, and then her critics in the Democratic Party who smear her as being a Kremlin asset. It's like no one is allowed to just be consistent across the board. You have to, in every conflict, take a certain tribal side, an ethno-nationalist side. And Tulsi, in the case of Russia, Ukraine, Syria, I think found herself on the right side. Now, in the case of Israel, she can't apply the same standards. Now she has to go and adopt the same smear tactics of her detractors. And the people who said that she was driven by Islamophobia from the start, you know, in terms of her critique of the dirty war in Syria, the critique of her was that I was driven by Islamophobia. And I resisted that at the time because I appreciated that somebody was willing to take a brave stance against the dirty war. And also, I didn't know what's in her heart. I don't want to assume what her own bias is. But those people who said that, I think, are looking increasingly vindicated based on what she's saying now.
I mean, she would make an effort to appear with Muslim groups. I mean, some of them would be like Ahmadiyya groups, which is a group that's very conciliatory and you know, collaborationist in Pakistan. But she was still making an effort to identify herself not as a full-on Islamophobe. You know, you would see photos that she would post in Syria of her with just average people who are affected by the regime change war. But now she's pretty much just sold her soul to Conservative Incorporated and is just saying whatever they want, and obviously knows nothing about Palestine or its history. Nothing. And lumping Sunni and Shiite together in this global attempt to exterminate all Jews is just brainless. And how do your anti-war politics stop at Israel-Palestine when this is so clearly driven from the point of view of Washington by the inexorable march towards a regime change war in Iran, which Tulsi Gabbard herself has challenged in the past? How do you compartmentalize and divorce this from the Wolfowitz Doctrine, the Project for a New American Century, the fact that Victoria Nuland is the number 2 person in the State Department, acting Deputy Secretary of State, married to the co-author of the Project for a New American Century, whose father, Donald Kagan, the day after 9/11, called for the U.S. to wage war on Palestine, to blame Palestine for 9/11 and to attack Palestine. And that's what the U.S. is doing now. The U.S. is engaged in a regime change war in Palestine, which is a war on the Palestinian people, and Tulsi Gabbard has endorsed it.
What did Netanyahu say after 9/11? He said basically, this is great for us. This is great for Israel.
He said that in a speech reported in Israeli media. This is good for Israel. And what he meant was the world will now see what we're going through, and we will be able to act with a free hand against Palestinians. So Netanyahu wasn't prime minister then. It was Ariel Sharon George W. Bush went over to meet with Sharon, and Sharon whispered in his ear, he said, you know, Arafat is our bin Laden. And what he was trying to do is the same thing that the Israeli government is successfully doing with the Biden administration, which is to reframe Hamas as ISIS. So that the global war on terror ultimately will boil down to Israel's war on Palestine, and Israel will be allowed to finish the job that it started in 1948. Bush, by the way, didn't buy that. George W. Bush didn't go along with that. He pushed the phony peace process. There were several points when Condoleezza Rice actually went to Israel and stopped ground invasions of Gaza.
Yeah, it's true. It's like Biden is making Bush and his clique look somewhat humane by comparison. When Israel killed civilians in strikes that it said were targeted at Hamas leaders, Bush even criticized that, which I was shocked to learn recently. I don't remember that, but now it's just a full-on green light by Biden. And of course, Bush gave a full-on green light to Israel's crushing of the Second Intifada. It was brutal. I don't want to pretend that Bush was some kind of humanitarian, but by comparison, he looks better than Biden.
Well, they had this phony peace process, which gave the U.S. skin in the game about what happens on the ground in Israel, Palestine. That's been shredded. That was shredded by the Abraham Accords and the Trump administration and by the Israeli government itself. But one of the ways that Israel began systematically undermining the peace process was by assassinating the leadership of the Al-Qassam brigades, the military wing of Hamas, during ceasefires in order to instigate responses by Hamas. First with Yahya Ayyash, who was the second leader of the Al-Qassam brigades. They had him killed by a collaborator who handed him a cell phone that was detonated by a helicopter and blew his head off. And then the killing of Salah Shahada in 2002 under Bush during a ceasefire, which George W. and they killed him. This was the first time Israel did this openly. They dropped a 2,000-pound bomb on a housing complex, the same way they just did in the Jabalia refugee camp, in order to get one man. So they exterminated numerous families to get one guy. And the George W. Bush administration condemned Israel for doing that because it led to a major escalation in the Second Intifada and set the stage for the dissolution of the so-called peace process. So Biden, I mean, there's no leverage anymore. The peace process gave the U.S. some vague leverage. There is none, unless they're willing to say we will not give you more missiles for your Iron Dome batteries. The Iron Dome batteries ran out of missiles to deter Palestinian rockets early on in this conflict, and the U.S. had to arrange this basically an air bridge from the U.S. to the Mediterranean to replenish their stocks. Until the Biden administration is going to say, sorry, buddy, which they're not, Israel can continue the slaughter of daily massacres.
And, I really want to stress this point. Whatever you want to say about Hamas now, and again, as I've said before, none of my friends in Gaza paint a very nice picture of Hamas. They're not fans. But there was a time when Hamas was saying, we accept the international consensus on the solution in Israel-Palestine, which was a two-state solution, a Palestinian state inside the 1967 borders with a just resolution of the refugee problem, which means just recognizing the right of Palestinian refugees to return. Not all of them returning, but at least recognizing that they have the right to, given that they were expelled from their homes in 1948, had their homes stolen. That was Hamas's position for many years. Jimmy Carter affirmed that. He went and met with the Hamas leadership and talked about how they had evolved. And if Israel and the U.S. had wanted to, they could have taken that up and could have engaged with Hamas's stated willingness to accept what the U.S. claims that they support, which is a two-state solution. But they didn't, because they don't want a two-state solution. They don't want to recognize Palestinian self-determination, even if that self-determination is confined to 22% of historic Palestine, which is a huge compromise for Palestinians. So the Israeli government and the U.S. government, whether it's Netanyahu or his predecessors who are slightly less fanatic, the Obama administration, the Trump administration, the Clinton administration, the Bush administration, none of them were willing to explore Hamas's overture toward peace. And if they had taken up that opportunity, and if they had seriously engaged with it, I don't think we'd be where we are today. But the point is, they're the fanatics. They're the ones who don't accept the existence of Palestinians. They're the projection of what they claim Hamas to be. They're the mirror image. They're the actual extremists here. And that's why I think we're in what we're in today.
Yeah, I mean, if you understand the logic of Zionism, and also if you go to just the West Bank, you'll see why Hamas's offer could not have been accepted by Israel and therefore by Washington, because they said that they would accept a two-state solution along 67 lines, along with the end of the siege and an airport in Gaza and basically normal life. And
the connection between West Bank and Gaza, so Palestinians can actually be in their state contiguously and travel and see their relatives and be in their land. This historic compromise of a land that is 22% of what it actually was before Israel came in.
I mean, I could talk for an hour about why that is off the table for any Zionist. One key reason is demographics. Israel is an ethno-supremacist state. According to the Zionist philosophy, it must maintain a significant majority of Jews over the indigenous Palestinian population on any territory it controls. So it says it doesn't control Gaza. It's a human warehouse that it controls from the outside. None of those people can be inside Israel or interacting even with people in Jerusalem or the West Bank, because then they'll have families and grow, and then they'll develop roots in other areas which Israel technically controls. Netanyahu himself has said that the demographic edge has to be 70% Jews to 30% Palestinians on the maximum amount of territory that Israel can control. Then you have the mega settlements around East Jerusalem, like Ma'ale Adumim or Ariel. Just go look at them. Those are giant cities that are built into the West Bank to section off the East Jerusalem Palestinians from the West Bank Palestinians. And the master plan of Ma'ale Adumim cuts the West Bank in half. Israel's military plan in the Gaza Strip right now is to cut the Gaza Strip in half, and then to destroy the population of the north and push everyone else towards the south. Ethnic cleansing, violent demographic engineering, in other words, which is tantamount to genocide. But if you just look at the lay of the land in the West Bank, you'll see why they could never accept a state along 1967 lines according to international law. So Hamas was basically throwing down the gauntlet and saying, look, you want a two-state solution? All right, we'll take a state. And they said no. And this is the response. I mean, this is the inevitable logical outcome of denying people the right to have rights, denying them sovereignty, is they're going to take up arms. It's just going to happen. It's happened throughout history.
Let's react to Antony Blinken. He's in Israel right now as we speak, and he spoke at a press conference and was asked about whether the U.S. is considering taking over Gaza.
And also, are there discussions at all to create a multilateral force for Gaza? And if so, would the U.S. be willing to take part in something like that? Thank you.
Thanks, Vivian. Here's what we know, and I think is agreed among everyone. There cannot and must not be a return to the pre-October 7th status quo. That's unacceptable. It's not tolerable for Israel. It shouldn't be acceptable or tolerable by anyone else. And that means that the idea of Hamas remaining responsible for governance, such as it was, and security, and posing an ongoing and enduring threat to Israel and its citizens is unacceptable. So that's one thing we know. We also know that Israel cannot reassume control and responsibility for Gaza. And it's important to note that Israel has made clear it has no intention or desire to do that. So within those parameters, we are and will continue to have discussions with partners throughout the region and well beyond about what should follow once Hamas is defeated. There are a number of possibilities, permutations, but it's really premature to get into any detail about that.
So many possibilities.
What are your thoughts, Aaron?
I mean, the assumption there is that the U.S. has the right to determine what should happen to Gaza to begin with. Like, did anybody in Gaza elect Anthony Blinken to help decide who should rule over them? Who they elected actually was Hamas, and then the U.S. responded under the Bush administration by organizing a coup to undermine that, and Hamas responded preemptively to prevent that, and Israel responded by imposing a full siege on Gaza and cutting it off, and that's why we're here today. But also notice how he says we can't go back to the status quo, not because 2.3 million people were in a concentration camp, but because we can't go back to the status quo because Hamas was in power. So the status quo of occupation, besiegement, keeping people in a ghetto, keeping the West Bank occupied, terrorized by these settler fanatics and the soldiers that protect them. That was a fine status quo. But the status quo that cannot endure is having Hamas still in control of Gaza. And what has Blinken said about that leaked document that you've reported on at the Grayzone about Israel's plans for just mass ethnic cleansing? That was from a Israeli think tank. I think it was linked to Israeli intelligence, basically approving this plan to basically kick everybody out into the Sinai. What has Blinken said about that as a possible plan? He hasn't, I think, spoken out against that, even though, according to this reporting, that's what Israel wants to do.
Yeah, I'll get to that in a second, but just to react to what Blinken said, it's important to bookmark those comments because he is outlining the objective of regime change in Gaza. That's the goal of the U.S. and Israel. And anything less than that is a failure and a victory for Hamas. All Hamas has to do, because they've laid out this maximalist goal, which betrays complete ignorance about Palestinian society. Anything less than that is a victory for Hamas. So they have set the stage for failure because Hamas is deeply embedded in Palestinian society. And even people who don't support their political wing admire the Al-Qassam brigades and their fight. And they're producing generations of fighters by destroying entire families right now.
Oh, of course. Of course. If you're living in a concentration camp, you have no hope, no job. You can't even leave. For many of these people who broke out, in fact, for all of them, this is the first time that they left the concentration camp. What else are you doing with this bombardment by creating more generations of fighters?
And the fighters who fought on October 7th and who are fighting right now, most of them have lost family members in airstrikes. Have no hope, no future, no chance of ever leaving their little prison. They are the poor of Gaza mostly. They're not the English-speaking people who you might follow on Twitter from Gaza, who have education and who are technically savvy and launch startups with UAE investment. These are the people. This is a salt of the earth, and they have nothing to lose out there. The only structure they've had is summer camps provided by Hamas, and that's a structure. That's the destabilized life that Israel has brought to them. So Blinken has no idea what he's doing. He said, we're going to solve this through discussions with regional partners. They're leaning heavily on Qatar, but where's that going to go? They're just setting the stage for this to be resolved through force, through a regional war, because Blinken has no plan. You can just look at his cold, dead eyes, and there's nothing behind them. There's no plan. There's no understanding. It's very much like Samantha Power when she said, when she was asked about Libya, and she said, we didn't know much about that society or what would happen next. Well, then why did you just go in there with guns blazing, blowing up the one person who created that society, who knew everything about it, who was warning you that Al-Qaeda and ISIS would fill the void, and who was absolutely prophetic about what would happen next? Why did you do that? Because you're a neo-colonial, arrogant, ignorant product of America's foreign policy training institutes and the foreign policy establishment. And they will be discredited again through this assault. And they'll continue to recycle the same personnel in the next administrations, unless we write in a melon 2024. So this the point about the ethnic cleansing document, Aaron, there's this whack job named Amir Weitzman, who is the head of the Libertarian Committee for Likud. Many people watching this might have seen him in a debate on RT where he threatened the anchor and said, "We're going to support Ukraine if you don't, if Russia doesn't support Israel, we're going to give Ukraine weapons." And he wrote this paper for a think tank that's connected to the Likud party called, I think, the Institute for Zionist National Security Strategies, something like that. And so we reported on it at the Grayzone. Kit Clarenberg reported on it, and people weren't really, they were kind of shrugging like, "Oh, wow, another crazy Zionist guy in Likud." Suddenly this document shows up on the intelligence ministry on its website. And it had been adopted as an official blueprint for Gaza by the Ministry of Intelligence, which is a small ministry. Israel's tried to play it off and say, "Oh, it's not really, this isn't like the Shin Bet. It's not like our actual intelligence apparatus." But it is a government ministry which adopted this blueprint, which calls for pushing the entire population of Palestine, of Gaza, into the Sinai Desert and forcing Egypt to house them and actually paying their rent to be housed in apartments outside of Cairo. And they said it will be cheaper to pay for them and to just basically pay off Egypt to take them than it would be to maintain them in Gaza. And October 7th provided us with the perfect opportunity to do so. So they're openly saying genocide. The Israeli government's openly adopting a plan for genocide written by a whack job. And then we have like incitement to genocide from so many Israeli leaders, so many members of Knesset. They're out competing one another for the genocide prize as their UN ambassador puts on a Star of David at the UN. What has Blinken said about that? Well, I asked the State Department the one time they called on me at a briefing, this was like October 10th or something, about the incitement to genocide by the Israeli leadership. And Matt Miller, the spokesman, said, when we hear this rhetoric, we'll deal with our allies in private. We will talk about it in private.
They love to brag about how they're having all these conversations with Israel in private. Like Jake Sullivan was asked about the killing of civilians and bombing of hospitals. And he said, yeah, we're in close consultation and we're having tough, frank conversations about how to meet objectives with tactics. So basically he's admitting that the only criticism the U.S. has is whether Israel is sufficiently meeting its objectives, not whether it has the right to pursue the objective of mass murder in the first place with the tactic of genocide. And then he says we're having all these conversations in private, and that's it. We're all supposed to be satisfied with that. And then Blinken creates this fake straw man where it's like he says we don't have to choose between defending Israel and aiding Palestinian civilians. It's the phoniest and most genocidal straw man I've ever heard, because the very act of so-called defending Israel means genociding Palestinians. So by definition, the same Palestinians you claim you want to aid, you're killing them. So basically he's saying we don't have to choose between helping Israel commit mass murder and providing a trickle of aid to those who manage to survive. And even then, when they survive, we kill them as they flee. We bomb ambulances, as Israel just did today. And what did Israel say? They admitted they did it, that they bombed the ambulance convoy near Al-Shifa. And what did they say? That Hamas was using one of the ambulances. So even if that's true, are you allowed to just bomb a bunch of civilians because a militant group is using an ambulance? And they don't even specify what they're using the ambulance for, which again, not that I take their explanation seriously for a second, but even if it's true, it's still, how can you justify that under the laws of war?
Well, they're not being held to the laws of war, even though the State Department constantly says they are. And what does this say about the rules-based order? What does the rules-based order even mean? Again, it means we make up the rules and everyone follows our orders. The Palestinians refuse to follow our orders.
Yeah, exactly.
That's why they're unworthy victims. They're in the way of the rules-based order. So you won't see a dusty boy pulled from the rubble, splashed across Western newspapers the same way that Omran Daknish, this so-called dusty boy in Aleppo, Syria, in December 2016, was put on newspapers around the world and turned into an international sensation in order to further regime change against the official enemy of Syria. These people
Even though
stand in
his
the way.
Even though his family was against regime change in Syria, right?
His family hated the white helmets and all of
Yeah.
the jihadist activists that flowed into East Aleppo. They were basically prisoners there. And they went on Al Mayadeen 2 years later, which is a pro-resistance network, and denounced the whole NATO project for Syria. And it kind of made the whole Western press look stupid. But the Western press isn't making Palestinian rescuers out to be heroes like they did the white helmets. They're not going to get films and Oscars and Nobel Peace Prize nominations. And these people they're not going to even get heavy equipment shipped in to help them dig themselves out, nor are the Palestinian doctors who are dealing with impossible conditions as their hospitals run out of fuel. They're not being made into heroes. They're all in the way of this giant imperial project, this sociopathic project. And so the best they can ask for, according to Tony Blinken, is humanitarian aid. And then when they go to get it, and they go to try to go to Rafah, as they did in an ambulance at Al-Shifa Hospital today, they get bombed by Israel while Tony Blinken's there, and he just shrugs and says nothing. He says nothing in public. So what other solution do they have? What other means do they have for redress? The only other means, the olive branch has been shredded and burned with white phosphorus, is the gun. That's all that's left. And
Max,
that's what we're going to see.
Max, if you'll let me, I just want to shout out my grade 9 teacher of environmental studies. That was the class. Mr. Raoul, Ivan Raoul, is in Vancouver, a lifelong peace activist. My whole life, I've always seen him at every protest, and he just gave us a shout out. So I want to thank you, Mr. Raoul, for your inspiration to me. And I'm so glad to see you out there. And thanks to everybody else who's been watching. I just wanted to acknowledge him.
Shout out to any of my former teachers and classmates who are watching. I doubt any are, but don't believe my Wikipedia page. Well, Aaron, in closing, I wanted to ask you about an issue that I wanted to ask you about some of the language that's being used by you and others. And I've always been reluctant to use the language of genocide because it's so exploited by our government to demonize official enemies and authorize sanctions when the case for genocide isn't really clear. But in this case, it really does appear to me to be a genocidal attempt to finish the job that Israel started in 1948. But there's other language that's being thrown around, and is first thrown around initially by Zionists and supporters of Israel. They put the Holocaust into play and call all their opponents Nazis. Gilad Erdan, the United Nations ambassador for Israel, donned a Star of David during General Assembly proceedings with "never again" written on it. Really sickening, cynical display as Israel was butchering families in their homes in Gaza, but claiming that the UN was some kind of Nazi entity and that they wanted to see Jews exterminated. He actually was denounced by Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Jerusalem, and by Danny Dayan, who's a settler leader in the West Bank, said that he was abusing the memory of the Holocaust. But Aaron, you have referred to Israel on this stream and on Twitter as a Nazi state or engaged in Nazi activities. And I wanted you to explain why you're using that language.
Well, I mean, nothing to me can compare with the crimes of the Nazis. That was unprecedented industrial scale mass extermination. And so, no two atrocities are the same. But what is Nazism? It's a belief in your complete supremacy. It's a complete dehumanization of the people you're trying to wipe out. And you're driven by this chauvinism, by this supremacy. And in furtherance of it, you're willing to exterminate innocent people in large numbers. And in the case of Israel, confine them to the largest concentration camp in history. Those are the words of Baruch Kimmerling, the late Israeli sociologist, well known in Israel. So how can I not compare them to Nazis and equate them to Nazis when, if you look at today in this world, who is committing crimes in the name of supremacy, openly dehumanizing the people you're wiping out, referring to them as animals, making no distinction between the Palestinian civilians and the Hamas leadership. All this is Nazi rhetoric. It's the crime in terms of sheer numbers, of course, is not on that scale, but the underlying attitude of just wanton disregard for human life, contempt, actually, for not just disregard, contempt for human life, because that's what drives Zionism. It's contempt for the indigenous Palestinian population, wanting to eliminate them. And yes, Israel's done that, not with complete mass extermination as the Nazis were trying to do, but with massive ethnic cleansing, driving Palestinians off of their land after so many years of peaceful coexistence before that, before 1948. So I think it's a totally fair comparison, especially because they're getting away with it. And it needs to be called out. And especially because they're trying to adopt the memory of the Nazi Holocaust, as we saw with that Israeli envoy wearing the yellow star. So in that context, I think it's totally appropriate to call them for what they are, which is a modern day Nazi state.
Well, a Holocaust is a giant conflagration, and it was a term adopted for the Jewish genocide in World War II. It was a genocide that did not only involve Jews. People were killed for being Russian, for being Roma, and so on. But the term Holocaust was sort of adopted as a way of marketing the reality of Jewish persecution and extermination during World War II. And looking at Gaza, I see what took place in World War II as a Holocaust, not the Holocaust,
right?
Because this is another Holocaust. And you can say that it's part of a wider Holocaust of Palestinians, because it's clear to me that the intention of the self-proclaimed Jewish state, which is not Jewish in my understanding of it, but self-proclaimed, is genocide. It does not want any accommodation with Palestinians. And now it's going for the goal of finishing 48. And we're witnessing a Holocaust of bullets, of missiles, of white phosphorus, of drones. And having been under those missiles and bombs for a few nights in Gaza, I'm telling you, none of you can imagine what it's like, what they're going through. None of you can imagine the sheer terror of what it's like to spend all night wondering if the roof is going to come down on your head while bombs just explode all over you, while naval ships are right off the shore that you can see shelling your city. The drone is over your head. You hear screaming, windows are breaking, and then you wake up and pull your neighbors out of the rubble. None of you can imagine what it's like. And so on the concept of, on this idea of the term Nazi, I mean, I think what a lot of Israelis are doing is reenacting the Holocaust spiritually through this assault on Gaza. They have had it drilled in their minds that if they give up first of all, you're taught constantly about the Holocaust in Israeli public education. A large percentage of Israeli youth are sent to Auschwitz on free trips by the education ministry to prepare them for army service. And they're terrified into thinking that genocide will be committed against them unless they participate in the military, and they act with complete ruthlessness against Palestinians or Lebanese people or Iranians. And that helps produce a genocidal mentality. The education ministry finds that Israeli youth are more tolerant and peace-oriented and distrustful of the military before they go on these trips to Auschwitz than after. So they've inverted the lessons of the Holocaust from never again to anyone to never again to us, to produce the most militarized society on the planet, which, if you look at Israeli attitudes, polls of Israeli attitudes among the youth are comprehensively racist towards Arabs and even Palestinian citizens of Israel. Then this idea of just following orders. That's sort of a Nazi idea to me. The inability to think outside of the collective, and the idea that anyone who thinks differently or is a critic is a wicked son the leftists, the anti-war people I know, these scattered, isolated forces in Israel right now, they're all laying low. They're afraid to go out in public. They're afraid to come on this stream. They're afraid to speak up. I'm communicating with them quietly, but they are targets. And their homes, I mean, the homes of those who have spoken out have been attacked by right-wing mobs. There's one person who I wrote about in my book, Goliath, who is sort of a moral beacon for me from within Jewish Israeli society. He is a long dead Jewish Israeli philosopher who is one of the first critics, open critics of the Israeli military. He's an Orthodox Jewish philosopher named Yeshayahu Leibovitz, Leibowitz, or you could spell it Vitz. You can look up his videos. I really recommend reading his writing. He's someone who had enormous cachet within Jewish Israeli society, and he used that cachet to start urging young people to refuse military service, lest they become, in his words, a Judeo-Nazi. And I want to play some video of him where he lays out his argument in public in Israel about what a Judeo-Nazi is. And this is an Orthodox Jewish philosopher of Israel, Yeshayahu Leibovitz. In this documentary about him produced by Israeli filmmaker A. Van. Sorry, this is in Haifa. You can see he's popular among a certain segment of society. I'm literally overwhelmed by requests from people who turn to me. Some want to see me. Some telephone or write. I'm not exaggerating when I say that I'm overwhelmed. You can hardly say what I say has no impact here. One of the subjects that people raise most frequently when they come to see me and they come of their own accord. One of the subjects they raise is that of refusing to serve. They come to talk to me about it in their dozens, I would say in their hundreds. They know. They have discovered, but who doesn't know today? The entire world knows. From Australia to Norway, that we use torture in territories. Torture. We use it by virtue of the authorization given by the monster who only 3 years ago was president of the Supreme Court of the state of Israel. Some who in practice is more important than the president or the prime minister, that's true, and who deliberately legalized the use of torture in order to make Arab prisoners talk. That's what I mean by Judeo-Nazi. Yes, Landau. He was the one who legalized the use of torture, of moderate physical force. And here's Leibovitz. In other words, there are Judeo-Nazis. Judeo-Nazis exist. Does it shock you? I'm not shocked. I'm making an observation. If I raise my voice, it's because some people still don't know. That's why I shouted out loud. Judeo-Nazis do exist. So that was Yeshayahu Leibovitz from another time. And I think he describes a very real phenomenon that is unfortunately more present than ever. And he is it's well worth reading him. What he predicted before he died, before the siege of Gaza, before the Second Intifada, that Israel will erect concentration camps and will become so morally depraved that it will eventually commit political suicide. That is Gaza. So that's all I have to say for today. Aaron, anything to add?
No, just if you're in DC or near DC, you can make it Saturday, 2:00, Freedom Plaza, protest for Palestine, and anywhere else around the country or around the world where protests are happening. I know in Canada there's a huge National Day of Action too. I know this is happening everywhere, and it's it's the least we can do right now is go out and show our voices. I noticed some Democrats are now shifting their rhetoric a little bit, but still embarrassing. So, for example, I just wanted to point this out. Chris Murphy said that the current rate of civilian death inside Gaza is unacceptable and unsustainable. He could have stopped it at unacceptable. What the hell does unsustainable mean? That implies that there's a sustainable level of Palestinian civilian death inside Gaza, but Israel is currently not meeting it. So right now it's unsustainable. So therefore he's saying he wants Israel to reconsider its approach. He doesn't even say a full ceasefire. He wants Israel to reconsider its approach. And Bernie Sanders, who's the best we can do inside the Senate Democratic caucus, he says we need a humanitarian pause, not even a full ceasefire. So that's where we're at. And that's why pressure on these people is paramount at this point, because all these people, even those at the extreme end of the Democratic Party, those calling for things like a more sustainable level of civilian death or calling for humanitarian pause to the massacres, not a permanent end to them, these are the people that need to be pressured to take an actual minimally decent stance. And protests are one way of doing that.
I'm going to go to the rally just to avoid going crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a psychological war. Israel wants you to see these images so that you become demoralized. And it's not going to happen. So I'm going to go. I mean, I can't stop having nightmares, and I'm going to go just to avoid going crazy first. Whatever political considerations are there, second. I think speaking up like Yeshayahu Leibovich did is it's our only recourse. And it helps just avoid the psychological agony that comes with repression when you hold back. I remember the first time I started speaking up about this, there was enormous pressure on me not to. After I'd come back from the Birthright Israel trip, this free trip to Israel, and I started speaking up on the forums, the Birthright forums, and I got an angry call from a rabbi who started threatening me for saying that blowing up the education ministry in Ramallah was disgusting and reminded me of Kristallnacht. So, there's always going to be pressure, but the pressure recedes once you just show that you're not going to be intimidated. And you don't care if you're going to be working for some fancy law firm out of school. I mean, the psychological price, I think, of not speaking up is too high. So I'll see you there. London, Trafalgar Square, 2 p.m. Freedom Plaza, DC, 2 p.m. I mean, I don't even like half the groups that are organizing it. Like some of them attack the Rage Against the War Machine rally. I don't care. You just have to be there. It's not even about that anymore.
Yeah, that's right. All right, everyone.
Like the stream, subscribe, support. You know what to do. We'll be back next week. Peace.
Peace, everybody.